It is the evening of the 12th of August 2015, and everything in the port of Tianjin is seemingly as normal. Various chemicals and goods are stored on site, waiting to be imported and exported from Binhai Economic Zone in China. It is the largest man-made port in mainland China, and workers are busy on site at hundreds of different industries. Without warning, a fire begins inside a storage warehouse on a 46,000 square metre site responsible for handling hazardous chemicals. The burning quickly increases in intensity. As expected, firefighters swamp the site, attempting to douse the flames. In a breakdown of communication as to what's stored on site, no one is aware of the dangerous chemicals involved. Quickly, an explosion occurs, followed by an even bigger one 30 seconds later. What has happened is one of the world's top 10 non-nuclear explosions. Today we're looking at the Port of Tianjin disaster. My name is John, and welcome to Plainly Difficult. Today's video wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for my Patreon, YouTube and Ko-fi members. If you want early access to the channel's videos, then you can from £1 per month, and as always the links will be in the pinned comment below. A very big port. This is Tianjin. It is the 7th busiest port in the world, giving access to the Yellow Sea. It is also the largest man-made port in mainland China. Needless to say, this is one big-ass place. Hardly surprising, being located in mega import and exporting China, and being located not too far from the country's capital city, Beijing. Stupid amounts of material pass through the port every day. The site comes under the control of the Tianjin Municipality People's Government. It is a key part to China's market-friendly policies, and as such, it draws in a lot of international investment opportunities. Nearly half of the top 500 Fortune global companies have some sort of presence in the area. Because of this, many companies are set up to try and get a piece of the international juicy pie. One such company created to operate in the Tianjin port area was the Dongyang Bonded Port Ruhai International Logistics Company. It was formed in 2012 by two businessmen, Yu Jinwei, a Sinochem executive, and Dong Shenyang, a salesman. The latter of the two had connections within the port, namely from his father, who was the chief of police in the area. The two men set up their ownership of the company through other people to mask their involvement, but although on paper hidden, they were very much involved in pushing the company forward by any means possible. The company was to offer expedited customs and shipping for dangerous goods over the state-run entities, by leaning on their connections within the industry. An 11-acre site was acquired next to a new vehicle storage area. It was a little too close to residential areas for storage of deadly chemicals at just 500 metres, well, at least in the opinion of the first consultant the company called in for an environmental impact assessment. Not so much of an issue, they just got another consultant to give them the paperwork they required. As a note here, the guidance was that the nearest housing should be at least 1 kilometre away, or twice the distance that it actually was. The company, although not granted a licence to store chemicals on site by February 2014, it did begin holding client stock regardless. It was only given a temporary permission to do so in May the same year, essentially working outside the law for the first few months of operation. The company leaned on its contacts to expedite shipments for customers. It would be great for business, attracting more and more clients, so much so that the warehouse site had to be expanded, doubling the amounts of chemicals allowed in their temporary license. Containers were stacked higher than allowed and stored improperly in a confusing, messy mix of interchange shipments. Managers were not trained properly for their jobs, allowing poorly stored material and awful chemical handling practices to be widespread. Some of the chemicals that passed through the site were compressed and liquefied flammable gases, flammable liquids, flammable solids, materials that can spontaneously combust when in contact with water, including sulfur and calcium carbide. These chemicals are very important to know about, especially when dealing with firefighting activities. On top of the explosive stuff, the site moved toxic chemicals, such as sodium cyanide and corrosive products, the likes of formic acid, phosphoric acid, metacrylic acid, and even caustic soda. Around 1 million tonnes of chemicals were transported by the company per year, and as stated in an ARIA report, the company has 70 employees and generates an annual turnover of 30 million yuan, i.e. 4.2 million euro. Now, that temporary permit to operate would only last 6 months, but it wouldn't be an issue for the company, as it just operated without one between October 2014 and June 2015. They would be granted a new license, but it doesn't mean that the operation was anywhere by any means safe. The disaster. It is the closing hours of Wednesday, the 12th of August 2015, and a car fire has been noticed by nearby residents of the Ruhai International Logistics Company site. Not long after being reported, the first firefighters arrived on site at 10:56 p.m. However, access to the Ruhai storage area was hindered by overstacked shipping and chemical containers. By now, the fire seemed to have spread to a much larger incident than just one car. More firefighters arrived on the site. By now, much of the staff at the Ruhai site had fled the flames. Understandable, but this would be deadly. Little information was passed on to the firefighters. Because of this, and when confronted with the fire, they did what would be completely reasonable. They began dousing the flames with water. This was around 11:04 p.m, but the efforts would be in vain. The flames spread, prompting an evacuation. As police helped people escape, the fire continued to rage intensely. At 11:34 p.m, an explosion rang out from the site, registering a magnitude of 2.3, estimating an equivalent of 3 tons of TNT. The explosion then opened and exposed more chemical containers to fire and moisture. There would be no chance for anyone to react to the initial explosion for the first responders, as a second detonation rang out just 30 seconds later. This one would be a 2.9 magnitude. The second explosion was far greater, ignited the ammonium nitrate on site, created an explosion with an equivalent of 21 tons of TNT. Although this has also been estimated up to 400 tons of TNT. There is kind of differing reports on the amount of explosive force. The explosion shot out a shockwave, being felt up to 10 kilometers away from the epicenter. Almost everything within 1 kilometer had been eviscerated. Buildings, people, and material were completely destroyed. Beyond that, many buildings were severely structurally damaged, with windows being broken at the 10 kilometer mark. In total, around 17,000 housing units would be affected by the explosion in some sort of way. First responders were confused in the initial moments after the explosion due to improper communication between the different agencies involved. As such, no one really knew where the explosion had originated from and what the explosion was. And on top of that, they didn't know how many people were killed or even how much damage had been done. Many of the emergency first responders, upon reaching the site, didn't know they were dealing with toxic chemicals. As such, they weren't equipped with the proper protective equipment. This would later result in many reporting respiratory injuries from their exposure. Anyone who was found injured after the explosion was evacuated and taken to hospital. However, many remained unrecovered. When reaching the site, first responders prioritised searching for the survivors instead of trying to deal with the chemical disaster that was unfolding in front of them. As such, much of the deadly material was left to burn, releasing their toxic fumes into the atmosphere. The next day, after the explosion on the 13th, the military began to help with the emergency response. However, by the afternoon, firefighting had to be stopped whilst chemical experts assessed the remaining risks of the burning. By the time the emergency response had ended and the cleanup began, the death toll was estimated at 173, with nearly 800 injured, ranging from minor to life-changing injuries. The families of the dead firefighters amongst the victims would receive 2.3 million yuan, roughly $360,000 In addition to the 17,000 damaged buildings, 12,000 vehicles were written off, coming in to a cost, including infrastructure damage, at roughly $1.1 billion US. Aftermath. Cyanide was discovered in the river that was close to the site, which ran off into the sea, by the Environmental Protection Office of Taiwan. The recorded amount was well above the allowed limit. They also set up air monitoring equipment downwind from the site and discovered high levels of airborne pollutants, including methylbenzene, trichlormethanine, and epoxyethane, as stated in Preventing the Preventable by Susan Lloyd et al. The fire and explosions had created a terrible environmental issue. In order to try and prevent more chemicals running off into the local watercourse, a containment perimeter was made of a metre-high embankment. This was set up at a 3-kilometre distance around the epicentre. Eventually, air pollution levels were back to normal by September 4th, 2015. Now, the damaged properties were offered to be bought back by the Taiwan at a price of 1.3 times the pre-explosion value. But what was the cause? Well, we can break it down into 3 parts, the first being the initiating event, the second being the Ruhai company and the rules it bent to operate, and the third being the emergency response. Let's look at the latter first. The inadequate response to the initial fire and subsequent explosions was likely because the first responders were not fully prepared, likely due to being port employees and not properly trained firefighters. As noted by ARIA, they, the firefighters, were also very young, 18 or 19 years old, and had little experience. According to the press, their training is extremely limited. Physical training in the morning, short courses in handling the equipment, and a self-study manual. They were completely unprepared. And also by the second cause, the Ruhai company, who had been illegally storing far more chemicals that they were licensed to. This meant that the firefighters didn't know what they were dealing with. Chinese investigators discovered that more than 11,300 tons of dangerous goods were stored at the site, including explosive and combustible material, making up 800 tons of ammonium nitrate, 680 tons of sodium cyanide, and 290 tons of nitrocellulose, the latter of which was capable of self-igniting when exposed to heat. The first responders didn't know what was on site due to not being properly reported and stored. Investigators would file a report in February 2016. This would set out the initiating event. The report would place the beginnings of the explosion to nitrocellulose. You see, during shipping, to stop it from an unexpected whoopsie, it needs to be wet in an agent such as ethanol, isopropanol, or water. At Ruhai, this was done by placing the nitrocellulose in plastic bags with the wetting agent. Warehouse staff had accidentally damaged the plastic bags during transport. This allowed the wetting agent to evaporate and some of the nitrocellulose to fall out of the packaging. This meant that the highly combustible material was now exposed, and with the temperature on the 12th being 35 degrees centigrade outside, this allowed temperature within the materials container to rise, further drying out the nitrocellulose, to a point that its explosion was just a matter of time. So when all 3 parts of the disaster were combined, it is very easy to understand how it got so out of hand so quickly. 49 people would be charged and convicted from both government organisations and the higher-ups at Ruhai, with Yu Zhuwei being given a suspended death sentence with life imprisonment. The site of the blast was repurposed into a park named Haigang Park. It was turfed over and is described as an ecological park. So it's going to be a 7 on the disaster scale. And this is what I've got for my root cause analysis card. Do you agree? Let me know in the comments below. This is a Plain Difficult production. All videos on the channel are Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike licensed. Plain Difficult videos are produced by me, John, in a currently fairly cold corner of southern London, UK. And all that's left to say is thank you very much for watching. And Mr. Music, can you play us out please?